The Second World War was not won and lost only on the battlefields. It was won and lost in rooms nobody was allowed to enter. Inside wooden huts on a country estate in England. Inside a fenced-off city in the Tennessee hills that did not exist on any map. Inside a compound in occupied China, where the prisoners were called logs. Inside a Berlin address with no sign on the door, where doctors decided who would live and who would die. Behind every famous battle, every newspaper headline, every victory speech, there was a parallel war being fought in total secrecy. Some of these programs saved millions of lives. Some of them cost hundreds of thousands. Some of them would not be revealed to the public for 30, 40, even 50 years after the last shot was fired. This is the story of 10 of them. 10 programs that shaped the outcome of the war while the world was never supposed to know they existed. 1.
Ultra and Bletchley Park, the program that read Hitler's mail. About 50 miles northwest of London sits a Victorian country house called Bletchley Park. During the Second World War, this quiet estate became the most important secret in Britain. Behind its gates, inside a sprawl of wooden huts thrown up on the lawns, thousands of codebreakers were reading Germany's most private military messages almost as fast as the Germans were sending them. The program that produced this intelligence was called Ultra. The Germans never found out it existed. For 30 years after the war, almost nobody else did either. The problem that Bletchley Park was built to solve had a name: Enigma. It was a typewriter-sized machine the Germans used to scramble their military orders into unreadable code. Every day, German operators set the machine to a new combination of rotors and wires, producing billions of possible scrambles. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable. The British knew they had to break it, because if they failed, they would lose the war. German U-boats were already sinking so many supply ships in the Atlantic that Britain was months away from running out of food. The breakthrough came from a combination of Polish mathematics, British genius, and one of the oddest collections of minds ever assembled in one place. Polish codebreakers had made the first cracks into Enigma before the war and handed everything they knew to Britain in 1939. At Bletchley, the work was taken up by people like Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician, and Gordon Welchman, a fellow academic. They designed a machine called the bomb, which could test thousands of possible Enigma settings far faster than any human could. The first bomb, nicknamed Victory, was installed in Hut 1 in March 1940. An improved version called Agnus Dei, or Agnes for short, began working in August 1940. From there, the operation exploded. The work was divided into huts, each with its own job. Hut 6 broke the Enigma messages of the German Army and Air Force. Hut 8, run by Alan Turing, attacked the naval Enigma used by U-boat commanders. Hut 3 translated what Hut 6 produced into plain English for British military commanders. Hut 4 did the same for Hut 8. Later, when the Germans introduced an even more advanced cipher machine called Lorenz for Hitler's personal communications with his top generals, Bletchley built the world's first programmable electronic computer, Colossus, to crack it. By 1943, the site was decrypting around 3,000 German messages every single day. At its peak in 1944, around 10,000 people worked at Bletchley and its listening stations. Roughly 3 out of every 4 of them were women. The value of Ultra is almost impossible to overstate. When British commanders in North Africa fought Rommel at El Alamein in 1942, they often knew what Rommel had been ordered to do before Rommel himself had read the order. When the Royal Navy hunted down the German battleship Scharnhorst in December 1943, they found it using decrypted Enigma messages. When the Allies landed in Normandy on D-Day, they knew where the German divisions were stationed and how their commanders were reacting. Sir Harry Hinsley, who worked at Bletchley and later wrote the official history of British intelligence, estimated that Ultra shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. But the program only worked because the secret held. If the Germans had ever suspected their codes were broken, they would have changed them overnight, and every advantage would have vanished.
So Bletchley was protected by rules so strict they bordered on cruel. Every staff member signed the Official Secrets Act. A 1942 security notice reminded them, "Do not talk at meals. Do not talk in transport. Do not talk in the billet. Do not even talk by your own fireside." When British forces acted on ultra-intelligence, they had to invent a cover story first. Fake reconnaissance planes were sent out. A fictional master spy, codenamed Boniface, was invented, and his imaginary reports were used to explain where the information had really come from. Winston Churchill told King George VI that Ultra had won the war. In his own 6-volume history of the Second World War, Churchill did not mention it once. The silence held after the war ended. Bletchley staff went home and never told their families what they had done. Husbands did not tell wives. Mothers did not tell children. Some of them carried the secret to their graves. The wooden huts were emptied. The bombs were dismantled. Colossus was broken up into pieces and scattered. Not until 1974, when a former intelligence officer named Frederick Winterbotham was given permission to publish a memoir called The Ultra Secret, did the British public begin to learn what had happened inside those walls. Even then, many former codebreakers refused to speak. They considered themselves bound to silence forever. The British government did not formally recognize their contribution until 2009. What Bletchley Park quietly changed during the war is bigger than Enigma. The bomb machines and Colossus gave birth to modern computing. Alan Turing's ideas about what a computing machine could do now shape the device you are holding. The practice of a state building a vast industrial intelligence operation to read an enemy's communications at scale became the template for everything that followed, from the CIA to the NSA to the modern internet surveillance systems of today. The whole architecture of signals intelligence as we now know it was, in a real sense, invented on those lawns. Bletchley Park is the program that reshaped the 20th century, while nobody was allowed to know it existed. But if reading the enemy's mail was the quietest weapon of the war, the loudest was being built at the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, behind fences no civilian could cross. It was a weapon that would end the war in a single flash of light, and a program so secret that many of the people building it had no idea what they were making. 2. The Manhattan Project, the program to build the atomic bomb. In August 1939, a letter arrived on President Franklin Roosevelt's desk. It was signed by Albert Einstein, and it carried a warning. German scientists had discovered how to split the atom. If Nazi Germany built a weapon using that discovery, the war might be lost before it truly began. Roosevelt listened. By 1942, the United States had launched the largest, most expensive, and most secret scientific program in human history. Its goal was to build an atomic bomb before Hitler did. Its name was the Manhattan Project. The man chosen to run it was General Leslie Groves, an Army engineer who had just finished overseeing the construction of the Pentagon. Groves was not a scientist, but he was relentless, suspicious by nature, and obsessed with secrecy. To lead the scientific work, he picked Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant theoretical physicist from California. Together, they built something no country had ever attempted. A weapons program so enormous it required its own cities, its own factories, its own power plants, and its own army of workers, none of which officially existed on any map. 3 secret cities rose out of nothing. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the government quietly bought 60,000 acres of farmland and began building a uranium enrichment complex. At the height of the war, around 75,000 people lived and worked at Oak Ridge. Most of them were young women, hired straight out of small towns across the South. They were told to turn dials and watch meters all day, and never to ask what the dials were for. At Hanford, in the desert of eastern Washington state, 1,500 residents were forced from their homes, and an entire plutonium production complex was built along the Columbia River. At Los Alamos, on a remote mesa in the mountains of New Mexico, the bomb itself would be designed. Oppenheimer set up his laboratory inside what had once been a small boys' boarding school. Altogether, more than 130,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project. The cost, when the war ended, was about $2 billion, which would be tens of billions today. And the thing that made it all possible, the thing that held it together, was a rule Groves called compartmentalization. Nobody knew anything except what they needed to know to do their own small job. A construction worker in Oak Ridge might spend 2 years building a factory and never be told what the factory was for. A technician at Hanford might operate a reactor without ever being told it produced plutonium. Even the word uranium was forbidden in most conversations. Security was built into every corner of life. Each worker had a badge with a color on it: red, blue, or white. The color told the guards what buildings you could enter and what meetings you could attend. The perimeter of each site was ringed with barbed wire and patrolled around the clock by military police. Every piece of mail that came into Los Alamos or left it was read by censors. When the physicist Richard Feynman sent his wife playful coded puzzles in his letters, security officers questioned him and told him to stop. Feynman kept finding new ways to annoy them. It became a running joke inside the fence. The secret was kept from people you would not expect. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, his vice president, Harry Truman, became president. Until that moment, Truman had never been told the Manhattan Project existed. He had served as vice president for almost 3 months without knowing his country was building a weapon that could flatten a city. Members of Congress who had approved the spending had no idea what they were funding. Some of the scientists who worked on individual pieces of the bomb did not realize what they were building until they saw the newspapers in August 1945. By the summer of 1945, Germany had already surrendered, but the bomb was almost ready, and the war with Japan was still being fought. On July 16, 1945, in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the scientists gathered in the pre-dawn dark to test the first atomic bomb. The test was codenamed Trinity. When the device detonated, a flash brighter than the sun lit up the mountains for hundreds of miles. A mushroom cloud climbed into the sky. Standing at the observation bunker, Oppenheimer later said a line from a Hindu scripture had come into his head. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 3 weeks later, an atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered within a week. The full story of what the Manhattan Project was and what it had cost did not come out all at once. 4 days after Nagasaki, the United States government released a document called the Smith Report, which explained in general terms how the bomb had been built. But the deeper secrets held for years. Exactly how the weapons worked, exactly who had done what, exactly where the factories were, exactly how much plutonium and uranium had been produced. Much of it stayed classified for decades. Some parts of it are still classified today. What the Manhattan Project permanently changed is not just the shape of the war that ended in August 1945. It was the idea of what a government can secretly build if it wants to badly enough. 100,000 workers, 3 hidden cities, billions of dollars. All of it buried so deep in compartments that even the vice president of the country did not know it was happening. After the bomb fell, nothing about science, warfare, or state power would ever look the same. Every secret weapons program that has come since, in every country on Earth, is a child of the Manhattan Project. But while America was racing to build the ultimate weapon, another program, on the other side of the world, was conducting experiments that had nothing to do with winning a battle. Behind a wall in occupied China, in a place officially labeled a water purification unit, Japanese doctors were doing things to living human beings that would not be fully known to the outside world for decades. Its name was Unit 731. 3. Unit 731, Imperial Japan's Biological Warfare Program. A few miles south of the Chinese city of Harbin, inside the Japanese-occupied region, then called Manchukuo, there was a compound that locals were told to stay away from. On the map, it was listed as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Department of the Kwantung Army. That name was a lie. Behind the walls and dry moat, inside more than 150 buildings, doctors and scientists of the Imperial Japanese Army were running one of the most secret and most terrible programs of the war. It had one official goal: to build biological weapons for Japan. To do that, the men running it decided they needed to test those weapons on living people. The program's name was Unit 731. The man in charge of it was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. He was a medical doctor, trained at Kyoto Imperial University, tall and ambitious. In the early 1930s, he had convinced Japan's army that germ warfare was the future. Bacteria, he argued, were cheaper than bombs and harder to trace. Japan had already signed an international treaty banning germ weapons in 1925, but Ishii believed that ban proved just how dangerous such weapons could be. The army gave him a quiet corner of occupied China to work in, far from the eyes of the outside world. The first small facility opened at a village called Beiyin-he in 1933. After a prison break and a fire, Ishii expanded. By 1936, a much larger complex was being built at Pingfang, just outside Harbin. By 1939, it was fully operational, with its own power plant, its own rail line, and around 3,000 staff. The people the doctors experimented on were called marutas, which means logs. It was a grim joke. The cover story for the facility was that it was a lumber mill, so the human beings inside became logs. The prisoners were brought in at night, in black vans with no windows, driven straight through the gates and down into underground cells. They were given numbers instead of names. Most were Chinese civilians, suspected resistance fighters rounded up by the Japanese military police. Some were Korean and Mongolian. Some were Soviet prisoners of war. A smaller number were American and European prisoners captured later in the war. Nobody assigned to the inner prison of Unit 731 ever walked out alive. The experiments are difficult to read about, and they should be. Prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid, and then dissected while still alive, without anesthetic, so the doctors could watch the diseases work. A physiologist named Yoshimura Hisato studied frostbite by forcing prisoners to hold their bare limbs in freezing water until the tissue froze solid, then struck the limbs with a cane to judge the damage. Other prisoners were locked inside pressure chambers to see how much their bodies could take. Others were deprived of food and water to record how long a human being could survive. Women were forced into pregnancies, then deliberately infected with disease so researchers could examine the mothers and the unborn children. Families were sometimes brought in together, including small children, and killed inside the inner yard. Some of what happened there has been confirmed in the man's own words. In a 2006 interview, a former Japanese technician named Yoshio Shinozuka described helping with the vivisection of 4 prisoners who had been infected with plague. He remembered them crying out as the scalpels began. He was 19 years old at the time. The killing did not stay behind the walls. Unit 731 and its sister units across occupied China were not just a laboratory. They were also a weapons factory. Ishii designed special porcelain bombs that could be dropped from aircraft. The bombs carried fleas infected with plague. In the autumn of 1940, Japanese planes flew low over the Chinese city of Changde and released plague-carrying fleas along with rice and wheat, which would draw rats. The outbreak that followed killed thousands. In 1942, in Yunnan province, Japanese planes dropped cholera-filled ceramic bombs on the city of Baoshan. The epidemic that came after is estimated to have killed more than 200,000 Chinese civilians, most of them refugees fleeing the bombing. Similar attacks were carried out in Zhejiang province, in Shandong, and in Inner Mongolia. The total number of Chinese civilians killed by Japan's biological warfare program over the course of the war is estimated at around 300,000. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945 and Soviet tanks began rolling across the Manchurian border, Ishii received orders from Tokyo: destroy everything. Unit 731 staff burned their records, dynamited parts of the facility, gassed or poisoned the last of the prisoners, and shot the 600 Chinese laborers who had worked on the grounds. Then they fled back to Japan by train. Ishii ordered his men to take their secrets to their graves. Many of them did. What happened next is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of the story. The United States Army found out what Unit 731 had done. American investigators interviewed Ishii and his senior staff. And then, instead of prosecuting them, the American military offered Ishii and his doctors immunity from war crimes charges in exchange for their research data. The reason was cold and practical. The United States did not want the Soviet Union to have that data. At the International War Crimes trials in Tokyo after the war, Unit 731 was not mentioned. The only trial of Unit 731 personnel was held in the Soviet city of Khabarovsk in 1949, and it was dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda. Ishii himself was never charged. He died of throat cancer in his bed in 1959. Many of his former colleagues went on to hold senior positions in Japanese medicine, government, and industry. The Japanese government did not officially acknowledge that Unit 731 had existed until 1988. A Japanese court did not formally rule that Japan had engaged in biological warfare until 2002. Much of what we know today comes from old soldiers like Shinazuka, who spent the rest of their lives trying to tell what they had done. But while Imperial Japan was running its war of secret laboratories in the East, on the other side of the world, a different kind of hidden war was being fought. This one was fought with corpses, fake documents, and an imagination bold enough to trick Adolf Hitler himself into moving an entire army to the wrong country. 4. Operation Mincemeat, the corpse that invaded Sicily. In the spring of 1943, the Allied leadership made a decision. With Nazi forces defeated in North Africa, the next Allied move would be an invasion of the Italian island of Sicily. The problem was, everyone knew it. Sicily was the obvious target. Winston Churchill said as much in a private meeting. He said that everybody except a bloody fool would know the Allies were coming for Sicily, and that was the problem. If Hitler knew where the blow was coming, he would pack the island with tanks, troops, and guns. The invasion would turn into a slaughter before it began. British intelligence needed a way to convince Hitler to look somewhere else. What they came up with is one of the strangest military operations ever attempted. It was the brainchild of two men working in a quiet office in London. Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of Britain's Royal Air Force, a tall, awkward man with a thin mustache, and Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague of the Royal Navy, a peacetime lawyer and judge. Both were members of something called the 20 Committee, the unit in charge of running double agents against Germany. The plan they drew up was borrowed from an older idea by Admiral John Godfrey, the head of naval intelligence, and his personal assistant, a young officer who would later become famous for writing spy novels. His name was Ian Fleming. The idea was this: take a dead body, dress it as a British officer, put fake secret documents in a briefcase, and chain the briefcase to the corpse's wrist. Drop the body in the sea off the coast of Spain, where it would wash ashore. The Spanish government was officially neutral, but its leadership was friendly to Nazi Germany, and the country was full of German spies. The Spanish would find the body, photograph the documents, and pass the information straight to Berlin. If the papers were convincing, the Germans would believe the Allies were planning to invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily, and the real invasion would catch them unprepared. To make it work, they needed a body. Finding one that was fresh enough, unclaimed, and without relatives asking questions was harder than it sounds. The solution came in January 1943. A 34-year-old homeless man named Glyndwr Michael was found dying in an abandoned warehouse near King's Cross Station in London. He had eaten bread laced with rat poison. Some historians believe he had taken his own life. Michael had no family that anyone could find. His body was quietly handed over to Montague and Cholmondeley. The two men spent weeks building a fake life for Glyndwr Michael. He was given a new name, Captain, Acting Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They created an identity card with Michael's photograph but stamped with the rank and service of Martin. They wrote love letters from a fictional fiancée named Pam and slipped a photograph of a real young woman, an MI5 clerk, into his wallet to serve as her picture. They put in a receipt for an engagement ring, theater ticket stubs for a show in London, a letter from an angry bank manager complaining about an overdraft, and a bill from a tailor on Savile Row. Every small piece of paper was designed to make Major Martin feel like a real person with a real, slightly messy life. The documents that mattered most were 3 forged letters. The most important one was written by Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the British Imperial General Staff. Nye drafted the letter himself. It was addressed to General Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in North Africa, and it opened with the informal greeting, "My dear Alex." The letter described Allied plans to invade Greece and Sardinia and said the Allies would use Sicily only as a fake target to distract the Germans. It was the opposite of what was really going to happen. The body was placed inside an airtight steel canister, packed with dry ice to slow the decay. The canister was loaded onto the British submarine HMS Seraph, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Bill Jewell, on April 19, 1943. The crew were told only that the cargo was secret meteorological equipment. The Seraph sailed from Scotland to the coast of Spain. In the early morning hours of April 30th, 1943, about a mile off the port of Huelva, Jewell brought the submarine to the surface. He opened the canister, fitted a life jacket onto the body, chained the briefcase to the wrist, and read a short prayer from the 39th Psalm. Then he slipped Glyndwr Michael into the sea. A Spanish fisherman found the body a few hours later. From there, everything worked exactly as British intelligence had hoped. The Spanish authorities refused to hand the briefcase over to the British consulate. Instead, they sent the documents to Madrid, where German intelligence agents photographed every letter. Then, they carefully resealed the envelopes, returned them to the British, and reassured London that nothing had been opened. The Germans took the bait completely. On May 12, 1943, Bletchley Park intercepted a German message confirming that Hitler now believed the Allied invasion was coming in Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. Hitler issued orders that measures for the defense of Sardinia and the Peloponnese would take priority over everything else. A full panzer division was moved from France to Greece. 2 more panzer divisions in Russia were ordered to prepare to move south, just before the enormous tank battle at Kursk. General Erwin Rommel himself was sent to Greece to oversee its defense. When Montagu received the intercepted message, he sent Churchill a simple telegram. It said that mincemeat had been swallowed, rod, line, and sinker. The real invasion of Sicily began on July 9, 1943. The Allies expected the campaign to take 90 days. It took 38. Casualties were a fraction of what commanders had feared. Glyndwr Michael, buried in a small cemetery in Huelva under the name William Martin, had quietly saved thousands of Allied lives. His true identity was not publicly confirmed until 1996, when an amateur historian found his name in a declassified file. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But fooling Hitler about one island in 1943 was one thing. A year later, the Allies would attempt something bigger. They would invent an entire army, complete with a famous general to command it, and convince the Germans it was real for months after D-Day. 5. Operation Fortitude and the double-cross system. The invasion that wasn't. By 1944, the Allies had made up their minds. They were going to invade Nazi-occupied France. The landings would happen on the beaches of Normandy, in northwest France, on the morning of June 6th. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles would cross the English Channel at once. If it worked, it would open the door to Berlin. If it failed, it would set the war back by years and leave tens of thousands of Allied soldiers dead on French sand. Hitler knew the invasion was coming. He just did not know where. The Allies needed him to guess wrong, and the most logical guess was already his. Hitler believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only 20 miles from the English coast. He had fortified it with concrete bunkers, gun batteries, and some of his best divisions, including the elite 15th Army. To make Normandy work, the Allies had to keep those forces frozen at Calais, waiting for an attack that was never coming. The plan to do that was called Operation Fortitude. It was built on top of another secret operation that had been running quietly in the background for years: the double-cross system. The double-cross system was run by a small British unit called the 20 Committee, named after the Roman numerals 20, which also happened to mean double cross. Its chairman was a soft-spoken Oxford academic named John Masterman. Its job was simple and astonishing. By 1944, MI5 had captured every single German spy operating in Britain. Every one. Some had been arrested the moment they landed by parachute. Others had walked into British consulates abroad and asked to switch sides. A small number had been executed, but most had been turned. They were given a choice: cooperate with British intelligence and send false information back to Berlin, or hang. Most cooperated. Germany believed it had a thriving spy network inside Britain. In truth, every report that reached Berlin from inside Britain was written, or at least approved, by the British. The most important of these turned agents was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia. Pujol was an unlikely spy. He had been a chicken farmer in Barcelona before the war. He hated fascism. He had fought on both sides of the Spanish Civil War without ever firing a bullet. When the Second World War began, he walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered to become a spy. The British turned him down 3 times. So Pujol tried the opposite approach. He offered to spy for the Germans, telling them he would go to London and report back from inside Britain. The Germans accepted. They gave him the code name Arabelle. What Pujol actually did was move to Lisbon and invent everything. He wrote his German reports from Portugal using a tourist guidebook to London, a map of Britain, and an English to Spanish military dictionary. His fake intelligence was bizarre. He told his German handlers that Glasgow dockworkers would do anything for a liter of wine. But the Germans believed him. They paid him well. Eventually, British intelligence noticed that the Germans were moving ships around to chase imaginary British convoys that only existed in Pujol's letters. MI5 finally brought him to London in April 1942. They gave him a new code name, Garbo, after the actress Greta Garbo, because he was, they said, the greatest actor in the world. Pujol was paired with an MI5 case officer named Tomas Harris, a half-Jewish artist who spoke fluent Spanish. Together, over the next 2 years, the two men built the most elaborate fake spy ring in the history of espionage. They invented 27 fictional sub-agents living across Britain. There was a Welsh fascist, a waiter at a NAFI canteen, a soldier in an armored division, a secretary working in the British War Office. None of them existed. When one imaginary agent was supposed to be watching a specific port and failed to report a major ship movement, Pujol and Harris sent a letter to Germany saying the sub-agent had died of illness. The Germans sent flowers to his imaginary widow. By 1944, with D-Day approaching, Garbo was the most trusted German source in Britain. That trust was about to be weaponized on a scale that had never been attempted before. Operation Fortitude had 2 parts. Fortitude North was designed to make the Germans believe an invasion of Norway was being prepared from Scotland. But Fortitude South was the real weapon. It invented an entire army from scratch. The first United States Army group, known as FUSAG. On paper, it had 11 divisions and 150,000 men, supposedly camped in the southeast of England, ready to cross the Channel and strike Calais. FUSAG was almost entirely fiction. Inflatable rubber tanks were set up in fields, fake landing craft, made of wood, canvas, and empty oil drums nicknamed Big Bobs, were anchored in harbors along the East Coast. British signalers sat in underground tunnels at Dover Castle and beamed out fake radio traffic, pretending to be the headquarters of units that did not exist. To make the whole thing believable, the Allies needed a famous general to command it. They chose General George Patton, the man the German High Command feared most. Patton, who had been removed from a real combat command after slapping a soldier in 1943, was put in charge of the imaginary army. He toured England, gave speeches, and was photographed doing it, knowing every move would be reported. Through all of it, Garbo fed Berlin a constant stream of reports confirming that Fusag was real. In the early hours of June 6th, just before the Normandy landings began, Pujol sent a message warning the Germans of an attack. It was time to arrive too late for the Germans to act, but early enough to make Garbo look loyal. 3 days later, on June 9th, he sent a longer message arguing that Normandy was a diversion and that the real attack would still come at Calais. It was the most important message of his life. Hitler read it, believed it, and canceled an order that would have sent panzer divisions racing toward the Normandy beaches. Those divisions sat at Calais for almost 7 weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that would never come. On July 29, 1944, Adolf Hitler personally awarded Juan Pujol Garcia the Iron Cross. A few months later, King George VI made him a member of the Order of the British Empire. He is the only person known to have received medals from both sides of the war. But while the Allies were winning the War of Invisible Armies, the Nazi state was running secret programs of its own inside Germany. Programs aimed not at enemies across the Channel, but at its own citizens, hidden behind the walls of ordinary-looking hospitals. 6. Action T4, the Nazi program to murder Germany's own disabled citizens. In the spring of 1939, a father in Leipzig, Germany, wrote a letter directly to Adolf Hitler. His infant son, Gerhard Kretschmar, had been born with severe disabilities. The father asked Hitler's permission to have the boy killed. Hitler passed the letter to his personal doctor, Karl Brandt, and told him to make it happen. In July 1939, 5-month-old Gerhard Kretschmar became the first child murdered by the Nazi regime in what would grow into a systematic program of mass killing. He would not be the last. Over the next 6 years, the Nazi state would murder more than 250,000 of its own citizens, in secret, inside ordinary-looking hospitals across Germany. The program had a simple codename, T4. The name came from an address. Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin was a quiet villa in a leafy part of the German capital. It was the headquarters of the office that ran the killings. The villa was a front. It had no sign on the door. The officials who worked there did not tell neighbors what they did. Their orders came straight from Hitler's private chancellery, led by a man named Philipp Bühler, with Karl Brandt providing the medical authority. In October 1939, Hitler signed a short document on his personal stationery, giving the program legal cover. He backdated it to September 1, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland and the war began. He wanted the killings to look like a wartime measure. The logic behind T4 was the pseudoscience the Nazis called racial hygiene. The regime believed that disabled people, the mentally ill, and the chronically sick were a drain on the German race and the German economy. Nazi propaganda described them as useless eaters and life unworthy of life. The goal was to remove them from the gene pool and eventually from the population altogether. The program began with children. In August 1939, the German Ministry of the Interior sent out a secret order requiring every doctor and midwife in Germany to report any newborn or child under the age of 3 who showed signs of severe disability. The forms asked about conditions like Down syndrome, microcephaly, blindness, deafness, and physical deformities. Parents were encouraged to admit their children to specially designated pediatric clinics for treatment. In reality, those clinics were killing wards. Inside, specially recruited staff killed the children with overdoses of the sedative luminol, or with morphine, or by slow starvation. Parents received a letter in the post a few weeks later, saying their child had died suddenly of pneumonia or some other illness. An urn of ashes was sometimes sent with it. No one was told the ashes were real or not. By January 1940, the program had expanded from children to adults. T4 officials sent identical questionnaires to every psychiatric hospital, nursing home, and chronic care institution in Germany. Staff were told it was a routine survey. The forms asked about a patient's diagnosis, how long they had been institutionalized, whether they could work, and whether they had visitors. The completed forms came back to Tiergartenstrasse 4. There, a handful of doctors reviewed them. They never saw the patients. They never read the medical files. They simply marked each form with a plus sign or a minus sign. A plus sign meant death. 6 killing centers were built inside existing hospitals and castles. Grafeneck Castle in Baden-Württemberg, Brandenburg on the Havel, Hartheim Castle near Linz in Austria, Sonnenstein in Saxony, Bernburg in Saxony-Anhalt, and Hadamar in Hesse. Patients marked for death were loaded onto buses with painted-over windows, so the people inside could not be seen, and so the people outside could not see in. The buses were nicknamed the murder buses by locals who saw them arrive. At the killing centers, the patients were undressed, told they were going to take a medical shower, and led into rooms disguised as tile bathrooms. The rooms were sealed gas chambers. Pure carbon monoxide, in steel bottles, was piped in through the shower heads. A doctor watched through a small window until everyone inside was dead. The bodies were then burned in crematoria built on the grounds. The numbers became enormous. Inside T4's own records, 70,273 people were killed at the 6 gassing facilities between January 1940 and August 1941. Grafeneck alone killed 10,824 people in its first year. Hartheim killed more than 18,000. Hadamar, at its worst, was killing nearly 100 people a day. The regime called it a secret. But in a country where buses kept arriving full at small-town hospitals and leaving empty, where families received identical form letters, where smoke rose from crematoria chimneys in places that had never had them before, it was the worst-kept secret in Germany. Local people called the buses by names. Rumors spread. Letters arrived reporting that a loved one had died of appendicitis in a hospital where they had already had their appendix removed. The man who finally said it out loud was Clemens August von Galen, the Catholic Bishop of Münster. On August 3, 1941, standing in the pulpit of St. Lambert's Church, Galen delivered a sermon that directly accused the Nazi state of murdering its own citizens. He said that if the regime could decide some fellow human beings were unproductive and kill them, then woe betide us all when we become old and frail. He told his congregation that the people being killed were our compatriots, our brothers and sisters. He filed formal murder charges with the local police. Thousands of copies of the sermon were printed and passed hand to hand across Germany. British planes later dropped the text as leaflets over German troops. The Nazi leadership was shaken. Arresting a popular Catholic bishop in the middle of a war might trigger a revolt in heavily Catholic regions. On August 24, 1941, Hitler issued an order. The T4 program would be halted. Galen went into house arrest but was never prosecuted. Hitler told his aides he would deal with the bishop after the war was won. But the order was public. The killings were not. T4 did not stop in August 1941. It went underground and became what historians now call wild euthanasia. Patients were no longer gassed in central facilities. Instead, doctors in hospitals and asylums across Germany killed them quietly, one by one, with lethal injections of morphine, with barbiturate overdoses, and with deliberate starvation. The killings spread to bombing victims, to elderly patients, to foreign forced laborers. By the end of the war, the total number of dead is estimated between 250,000 and 300,000. The technology and personnel did not stay inside Germany's hospitals. The gas chambers, the sealed shower rooms, the technique of mass killing by carbon monoxide, and the men who had learned how to do it were soon transferred east. They would build the extermination camps of the Holocaust. Quote, _2, __. But while the Nazi regime was murdering its own citizens behind hospital walls, On the other side of the world, an entirely different kind of secret weapon was being built. One designed to set the forests of America on fire by riding a river of wind across the Pacific Ocean. 7. The Fugo balloon bomb campaign, the first intercontinental weapon. On the morning of May 5, 1945, a young pastor named Archie Mitchell drove his pregnant wife Elsie and 5 children from his Sunday school class up into the mountains of southern Oregon. They were going to have a picnic. The war in Europe had ended 3 days before. The war in the Pacific was winding down. It was a warm spring Saturday near the small logging town of Bly. Archie parked the car to unload the food. Elsie and the children walked a little way into the pine forest. A moment later, Archie heard one of them shout that they had found something strange on the ground. Before he could answer, there was an explosion. Elsie and all 5 children were killed. They became the only combat deaths to occur on the mainland of the United States during the entire Second World War. They were killed by a weapon launched from a beach 6,000 miles away. That weapon was called Fugo. It means, roughly, wind ship weapon. It was Imperial Japan's attempt to attack America itself using one of the strangest and most original ideas of the war: a paper balloon. The idea was born out of Japanese desperation. In April 1942, American bombers had launched the Doolittle Raid, the first air attack on the Japanese home islands. The raid did little damage, but it humiliated the Japanese high command and proved that Japan could be reached. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo wanted revenge, but Japan had no long-range bomber that could reach America, so its scientists turned to the sky itself. For nearly 20 years, a Japanese meteorologist named Wasaburo Oishi had been studying strong, fast winds blowing high above Japan from west to east. He had discovered what we now call the jet stream. Oishi's work had been ignored by scientists in other countries. The Japanese military now saw it as a weapon. The plan was simple in principle and fiendish in execution. Build a hydrogen balloon large enough to carry bombs. Release it in winter, when the jet stream was strongest. Let the wind carry it across 6,000 miles of ocean in 3 to 4 days. Then, have the balloon drop its bombs somewhere over North America. The idea was to start enormous forest fires in the American West, force the United States to divert firefighting and military resources away from the Pacific, and spread fear among American civilians. The balloons themselves were beautiful and strange. Each one was 33 feet across when inflated, made from sheets of washi paper crafted from the bark of the kozo tree, a relative of the mulberry. The paper was too fragile to hold hydrogen on its own. The solution was potato flour paste, brushed between overlapping squares of paper to glue them together into a tough, canvas-like skin. The work of making the balloons was done largely by Japanese schoolgirls. Their schools around Tokyo, including large buildings like the Takarazuka Theater, were converted into factories. The girls were never told what they were making. They sat on cushions, gluing paper squares together, mixing konjac paste by hand. Some of them were only 13 or 14 years old. Below each balloon hung a metal ring called a chandelier. It carried bombs, usually one anti-personnel bomb of about 33 pounds and several smaller incendiaries, plus a ring of 32 sandbags. The most ingenious part of the whole design was the altitude control system. The balloons had to stay high enough to ride the jet stream, around 30,000 feet, for 3 straight days. If a balloon sank too low during the cold Pacific night, a simple altimeter would trigger the release of a pair of sandbags, lightening the load and pushing the balloon back up. If it rose too high, a valve vented hydrogen. When the sandbags were all gone, the device had done its job, and a timed fuse would drop the bombs. The first launch took place on November 3, 1944, chosen because it was the birthday of the former Emperor Meiji. Japanese troops built 3 launch sites along the eastern coast of Honshu, one at Otsu in Ibaraki Prefecture, with 9 launch pads and its own hydrogen plant, one at Ichinomiya in Chiba with 6 pads, one at Nakoso in Fukushima with 6 more. Between the 3 sites, nearly 3,000 men were assigned to the balloon regiment. Between November 1944 and April 1945, they launched around 9,300 balloons into the sky. The balloons began arriving in North America within days. One of the first was spotted by an American naval patrol off the coast of California on November 4th, 1944. Soon they were being found everywhere. A Fugo was recovered near Kalispell, Montana, in December. An explosion was heard near Thermopolis, Wyoming, on December 6th. Over the coming months, balloons, or fragments of balloons, would be reported in 17 American states, in 5 Canadian provinces, in northern Mexico, and even as far east as Michigan. American authorities at first could not believe they were coming from Japan itself. Some officials guessed they were being launched from German submarines. Others suspected they were coming from Japanese-American internment camps on the West Coast. The truth was only confirmed when geologists at the United States Geological Survey examined the sand from the ballast bags. By studying microscopic sea creatures and mineral content, they determined the sand came from the beaches near Ichinomiya, Japan. On January 4, 1945, the American Office of Censorship asked every newspaper, radio station, and magazine in the country not to report on the balloon incidents. Editors cooperated almost completely. The result was eerie. Balloons were falling out of the sky across the American West, and almost no one in the country knew. The blackout had a purpose. If the Japanese heard nothing back about their weapon, they would assume it was not working. The blackout almost worked too well. On March 10, 1945, a balloon descended near Toppenish, Washington, and hit electric power lines. The short circuit knocked out power to the Hanford Engineer Works in Washington State, the top-secret plant producing plutonium for the Manhattan Project. Backup systems kicked in within seconds, but it took 3 days for the plutonium reactors to return to full production. A Japanese weapon had just briefly disabled the facility, making the material for the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Nagasaki. Neither Japan nor most Americans had any idea. In April 1945, Japan ended the program. The Japanese commanders, listening to American radio and hearing nothing about balloons, concluded the weapon was a failure. 6 weeks later, Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children, Dick Patsky, aged 14, Joan Patsky, aged 13, Jay Gifford, aged 13, Edward Engen, aged 13, and Sherman Shoemaker, aged 11, were killed in Oregon. Japan had already stopped launching. But while Japan was trying to float bombs across an ocean, Nazi Germany was building something genuinely revolutionary. A weapon that would fly faster than sound and that cost more lives in its making than it ever took in flight. 8. The V-Weapons Program, Peenemünde, Mittelwerk, and the slave labor rockets. On September 8, 1944, at 6:43 in the evening, a small explosion was heard in Chiswick, a quiet suburb west of London. 3 people were killed. No one on the ground had heard the sound of an aircraft beforehand, because nothing had flown over their heads at a speed they could hear. What had just hit the neighborhood was traveling faster than sound, falling from the edge of space. It was the world's first operational ballistic missile. Nazi Germany called it the V2. Nothing the Allies had could shoot it down. Nothing could warn people before it struck. And behind that single rocket was a secret program that had killed more people in its making than it would ever kill in flight. The V2 was born on a wooded island on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. In the late 1930s, a young German engineer named Wernher von Braun convinced the German army to let him build rockets. What von Braun really wanted was to reach space. What the army wanted was a weapon. The marriage of those two ambitions produced the A4, a 46-foot-long missile powered by liquid alcohol and liquid oxygen, with a 1-ton warhead at its nose. By October 1942, the A4 had flown to the edge of space and come down near its target. Adolf Hitler saw in it a miracle weapon that could hit London without sending a single pilot. On the night of August 17th and 18th, 1943, hundreds of British bombers attacked Peenemünde in an operation called Hydra. They did not destroy the project, but they damaged it enough that Hitler ordered production moved underground. The site chosen was a mountain called the Kohnstein, near the town of Nordhausen in central Germany, or an abandoned fuel storage mine ran deep into the rock. The underground factory was named Middelwerk, meaning Central Works. To extend the tunnels and build the assembly lines, the SS brought in prisoners from the nearby Buchenwald concentration camp. The subcamp where they were held was called Dora. The conditions at Dora in the autumn and winter of 1943 are among the worst that have ever been described. Prisoners lived inside the cold, wet tunnels for months, without proper beds, without washing facilities, and with barely any food. They dug the rock with hand tools while V2 assembly lines were being built around them. Dust from the tunneling filled their lungs. The dying were often left where they fell. When the SS finally built wooden barracks above ground in the spring of 1944, the death rate dropped only because treating the prisoners slightly better meant fewer assembly mistakes on the rockets. Over the course of the war, more than 60,000 prisoners passed through the Mittelbau-Dora camp system. They came from every country the Nazis had occupied: French resistance fighters, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish laborers, Belgian partisans, Roma and Sinti families, and, near the end, Jewish prisoners marched in from Auschwitz. Between 20,000 and 25,000 of them died. They were killed by starvation, by exhaustion, by disease, by beatings, and by public hangings inside the tunnels when the SS suspected sabotage. Between August 1943 and April 1945, they built around 6,000 V2 rockets. From September 1944 until March 1945, more than 3,000 V2s were launched against Allied cities. London was the main target. The city of Antwerp in Belgium, whose port was keeping the Allied army supplied, was hit even harder. More than 1,600 V2s fell on Greater Antwerp alone. The deadliest single strike of the entire war by any V weapon came on December 16, 1944, when a V2 hit the Rex Cinema in Antwerp during a packed matinee showing of a Western film. 567 people were killed. The total number of Allied civilians and soldiers killed by V2s across the whole war is estimated at around 9,000. Twice as many people died building the rocket as died being hit by it. Hitler's wonder weapon, when the arithmetic is done honestly, was more efficient at killing the people forced to make it than the people it was aimed at. When the war ended, the United States Army raced into Nordhausen ahead of the Soviet advance. The Americans were not there to document the crimes. They were there to collect the rockets and the men who had designed them. Wernher von Braun and more than 100 of his engineers were quietly brought to the United States under a classified program called Operation Paperclip. Von Braun would later design the rocket that carried Americans to the moon. Quote underscore 3 underscore. But while Nazi Germany was building rockets with slave labor, something far quieter was happening in a former girls' school in Virginia. American codebreakers were reading messages that would reveal just how deeply Soviet spies had already burrowed into the secrets of their own side. 9. The Venona Project. Reading the Soviet mail in secret. In early February 1943, a 22-year-old woman named Jean Grable walked into a former girls' school in Arlington, Virginia. A few weeks earlier, she had been teaching home economics to teenage girls in a small Virginia town. Now, with almost no explanation of what she would actually be doing, she sat down in a bare room lined with filing cabinets, and she opened the first of thousands of pages of Soviet telegrams. February 1st, 1943 is the official start of what would become the longest-running and one of the most important secret programs of the entire war. The Americans called it Venona. It ran for 37 years. Most Americans never heard the name until 1995. The Soviet Union was, at that moment, officially a friend. The United States and the Soviets were fighting on the same side against Nazi Germany. American factories were shipping tanks, trucks, aircraft, and boots to the Red Army under the Lend-Lease program. But one senior American military officer was not convinced. Colonel Carter Clark, chief of the Special Branch of the U.S. Army's military intelligence, did not trust Joseph Stalin. He was worried that Stalin might secretly sign a separate peace with Hitler and leave the Western Allies to face Germany alone. Clark ordered the Signal Intelligence Service to start reading Soviet diplomatic messages, to find out what Moscow was really saying to its embassies in the United States. That order created Venona. The problem Grabil and her colleagues were staring at looked impossible. Soviet communications used something called a one-time pad, a system that is, in theory, completely unbreakable. Each message is scrambled using a sheet of random numbers, and the sheet is used only once and then destroyed. If the system is followed perfectly, no codebreaker on Earth can crack it. The Arlington Hall team had no codebooks, no keys, and no point of entry. What they did not know was that the Soviets had made a mistake. In 1942, under the pressure of war and the German siege of Moscow, the Soviet agency producing the one-time pads had quietly run into a shortage of paper. To keep up with demand, they had printed some pages of the pads in duplicate and sent one copy to one Soviet mission abroad and the other copy to another. The mistake was small. The consequences were enormous. A one-time pad used twice is no longer a one-time pad. It can be broken. The man who spotted the pattern was Lieutenant Richard Halleck, a former archaeology student who had once translated ancient Babylonian texts. Halleck began working through Soviet trade messages in early 1943, looking for repeated sequences of numbers. He found them. By 1944, a young codebreaker named Cecil Phillips made a deeper break into the KGB's internal cipher, and on December 20th, 1946, another cryptanalyst at Arlington Hall, named Meredith Gardner, produced the first full translation of a decoded Soviet intelligence message. The message was about a Soviet spy ring operating inside the Manhattan Project. What Venona exposed over the coming years reshaped the Cold War. The decrypted messages identified Klaus Fuchs, the German-born British physicist who had passed atomic secrets from Los Alamos to Moscow. They identified Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were later executed for atomic espionage. They pointed to Theodore Hall, a 19-year-old Harvard-trained physicist working on the bomb, who had volunteered his services to the Soviets on his own initiative. They exposed Alger Hiss, a senior American State Department official. They identified Harry Dexter White, the second highest-ranking official in the United States Treasury. They revealed the existence of the Cambridge Five, a ring of upper-class British spies, including Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, who had quietly fed Moscow the secrets of British and American intelligence for more than a decade. The bitterest irony came in 1949. That year, the British government quietly sent one of its senior intelligence officers to Washington as the official liaison with American codebreakers. His name was Kim Philby. As part of his job, Philby was briefed on Venona, shown the decrypted messages, and told which Soviet agents had been identified. Philby was himself one of the Cambridge Five. Every warning he received from Arlington Hall, he passed straight back to Moscow. Venona was so secret that the Central Intelligence Agency was not told it existed until 1952. Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman were never fully briefed on what it had uncovered. Of roughly 200,000 intercepted Soviet messages, only about 3,000 were ever partially decoded, and many only in fragments. The program was finally shut down on October 1st, 1980. It was declassified in July 1995. Jean Grable, by then retired from a 36-year career, was officially recognized by the CIA as an American hero. She died in 2015, aged 94. But while American codebreakers were quietly reading the enemy's mail, the US Army was running another secret program on the battlefields of Europe, one that used rubber, paint, and recorded sound to make entire imaginary divisions appear out of thin air. 10. The Ghost Army. The 1,100 men who pretended to be 30,000. Inside a field in Luxembourg in the autumn of 1944, a group of American soldiers were heaving on ropes, pulling a 65-foot inflatable Sherman tank into position. Nearby, another group was hanging painted wooden fake artillery pieces in neat rows. A truck with enormous loudspeakers mounted on it was parked by a tree line, ready to broadcast the recorded sounds of an entire armored division on the move.
Down the road, in a shabby cafe, two American officers were loudly ordering drinks and complaining about the hard fighting ahead, knowing that a German spy in the corner would be scribbling down every word. None of these men were real soldiers in the usual sense. Their weapons were made of rubber, their tanks weighed 93 pounds. Their mission was to lie as convincingly and as loudly as possible. They were the Ghost Army.
The Ghost Army's real name was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It was activated on January 20th, 1944, by the United States Army and shipped to Europe just before D-Day. Its entire purpose was deception. 1,100 men, 82 officers, and nothing heavier than half-inch machine guns. Their job was to impersonate much larger American units so that the real units could disappear from the line, move somewhere else, and strike where the Germans were not looking. The unit was not built like a normal army unit. It was built like a theater company. The man behind the idea was Major Ralph Ingersoll, a celebrity journalist before the war who had been the managing editor of The New Yorker. Ingersoll called the men his con artists. He and the other planners recruited heavily from art schools, advertising agencies, radio, and theater companies. Many of the men had trained at places like the Pratt Institute and Cooper Union. Among them was a young fashion sketcher named Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous designers. A soft-spoken painter named Ellsworth Kelly, who would go on to become one of the most important American artists of the 20th century. A photographer named Art Kane, who after the war would take some of the most iconic music portraits ever made. The Ghost Army reportedly had one of the highest average IQs of any American unit in the war. The 23rd had three main components. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers, 379 men, ran the visual deception. They inflated the rubber tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even fake aircraft, and positioned them in such a way that German reconnaissance planes flying over at a distance would believe they were looking at a real armored division. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company handled sonic deception. Engineers from Bell Laboratories had helped them record the sounds of real American armored units in training at Fort Knox. The recordings were played back on enormous speakers mounted on half-track vehicles, which could broadcast the noise of tanks rolling through mud or pontoon bridges being built from up to 15 miles away. The Signal Company's special, 296 men, operated fake radio nets imitating the styles of specific radio operators from specific real units, so German listeners would hear the same signatures they expected. Between Normandy and the Rhine, the Ghost Army conducted more than 20 major deception operations. Their greatest success came at the very end. Between March 18th and March 24th, 1945, in Operation Viersen, the unit pretended to be the 30th and 79th American Infantry Divisions, two entire units totaling around 40,000 men. They inflated more than 600 dummy vehicles, transmitted fake radio chatter, and blared the sounds of pontoon bridge construction along a stretch of the Rhine River. The Germans believed them. A captured German map later showed the 79th Division marked exactly where the Ghost Army had pretended it was. When the real American 9th Army crossed the Rhine miles away on March 24th, they met almost no resistance. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed across the war. Roughly 30 were wounded. Military estimates credit the unit with saving between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. When the war ended, the men of the 23rd were sworn to silence. Their records were sealed. Their families were told nothing. The unit's deception techniques were valuable and might be needed again against a new enemy, the Soviet Union. For more than 40 years, they kept the secret. The first public article about the Ghost Army appeared in Smithsonian Magazine in April 1985. The unit was officially declassified in 1996. In 2022, the surviving members were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. 10 programs. 10 secret wars inside the war. Together, they shaped the outcome of the Second World War, just as surely as the battles on the beaches and the fields and the cities. and they are a reminder that the history most people know is only the surface, and that the real story of any war is always partly written in a language nobody is supposed to read. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.